Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Osiris.
Hi, yes. So, Rick, first, thanks for taking the question. About 24 hours ago, almost exactly 24 hours ago, you tweeted out, and I'll quote it. You said, "I can guarantee you that ETs have been recovered at crash sites. I no longer have any NDAs. Lou, Grush, and Dr. Davis are speaking the absolute truth." Um, so if you no longer are under any NDAs, that means that this information is no longer classified. If it's no longer classified, can you do one of two things or both? Either post that information that's no longer classified, or at a minimum, post the NDAs that you say you're no longer uh, under restriction of.
Yeah. Well, first of all, my NDAs or security oaths, we call them back then, expired in 2000, the end of 2000, September of 2001. So I'm not under any restrictions.
So what we just heard here is Doty using a little bit of truth and some not so true statements to try to bolster his credibility. Basically, Doty is correct in saying that there wasn't an NDA back in 1979 that was standardized. That's true. That didn't come around until 1983 with the standard form 189. But before the introduction of the standard form 189 for handling non disclosure of classified information, which actually came out after Executive Order 12356 back in 1982, various forms and agreements were used by different agencies and branches of the U.S. government. The Department of Defense and other agencies did not have a standardized approach across the entire federal government for non disclosure agreements related to classified information. In this aspect, Doty is correct. The forms and procedures varied significantly depending on the agency and the specific requirements at different times. So before the standard form 189, there would be agency specific forms and agreements, security briefings and various verbal agreements, oaths of office and oaths of secrecy, and even some earlier standard forms before the SF 189, but not across agencies. So in this fact check, Doty is being accurate. But then he mentions the expiration of his NDA. So let's fact check that. The transition to a more standardized approach with the SF-89 was part of a broader movement towards uniformity and strengthened security practices regarding the handling of classified information across the entire federal government. This was reflecting of increasing concerns over espionage and unauthorized disclosure that we were being faced with at the time. The current DoD NDA is actually called an NDA, not a security oath, and it's been called an NDA since March 11th, 1983, when President Ronald Reagan issued the National Security Decision Directive 84, titled Safeguarding National Security Information. In that directive, paragraph I, subparagraph A, directs the ISOO to issue a standardized non-disclosure agreement to be executed as a condition of access to classified information. The current NDA that is in place and in force now is the Standard Form 312, which replaced the Standard Form 189 and the Standard Form 189A. The SF312 has been in place since September 29, 1988. When the switch from the SF189 to the SF312 occurred, the government codified the following requirement in Title 32 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And I'm quoting 2003.20, subparagraph B, quote, all employees of executive branch departments and independent agencies or offices who have not previously signed the SF 189 must sign the SF 312 before being granted access to classified information. End quote. Now, that means that Doty, having taken a what he called a security oath, would have been required to sign the SF-312. Plain and simple. He would have had to have signed the SF-312. Now, here's where it gets even weirder. It's important to note that neither the SF-89, the SF-189, the SF-189A, and the current SF-312, none of them contains, carries, or implies an expiration date.
My NDAs, or security oaths, we call them back then, expired in 2000, the end of 2000, September of 2001. So
the terms of the SF-312, again the current NDA and not a security oath, clearly states that all obligations imposed on the signer apply during the times the signer is granted access to classified information and, quote, and at all times thereafter, end quote. There is no expiration date. So fact-checking Doty's claim that his NDAs are expired results in a false, as any person who has taken what Doty described as a security oath were then required to execute an SF-189, and the SF-189 does not have any provisions for expiration, and then they would have been subject to the SF-312 after that. Now, if Doty claims, well, I can't produce the documentation, nobody has the documentation anymore, it's important to know that the records retention policy of the SF-312 and the previous SF-189 and SF-189A requires that the original or a legally enforceable facsimile is retained for 50 years following its date of execution. So there is zero reason why Doty wouldn't be able to produce his NDA. An NDA that also O.S.I.R.I.S stated in their official report to Congress doesn't actually exist. As they plainly stated, there were no NDAs pertaining to UFOs and UAPs that were discovered during their investigation. So Doty's claim that he was under an NDA and now he's not because it's expired is false.
However, there are special access programs that I had access to that I know that I'm not going to talk about because I can't talk about. I tried talking about them a few years after my NDA expired, and Air Force came by and slapped my hand and said, "You can't talk about those things." I said, "Okay, I won't." But I had access to crash site data in a couple different ways. First of all, my indoctrination into the program occurred in 1979 when I was briefed into the United States government's involvement with extraterrestrials and UFOs. They didn't use UAPs back then. And so I was briefed on everything that we did from 1947, not everything, but a good portion of what we did, historically speaking, from 1947 on to 1979 that I'm getting a briefing. So, and that crash sites, the Roswell, Corona, Pelona Peak, Kingman, a couple in Nevada, those crash sites were in briefing. So I knew of those crash sites. So, and they were under various different plans. They didn't have special access programs back in those days when during the recoveries. They were created later on, I think 1968 and on. But they had special programs that Air Force OSI was involved with to protect these programs, a counterintelligence threat. As I mentioned earlier, that's part of the special projects branch of OSI is to protect these sensitive programs. And so that's how I knew Grush and those guys probably got the same exact briefing as I did, maybe an updated one because mine was in 79. So I'm sure there's a lot of things added since then. And plus, during my time as an OSI agent at Kirtland and at Area 51, I had access to information pertaining to recovered alien or extraterrestrial crafts. I saw some in hangars. Nobody said that came from planet such and such, and that extraterrestrial species was flying it. But they told the classification of that craft sitting in that hangar was that it was an extraterrestrial craft. So I was never briefed into every single thing regarding this subject.
So just to confirm, the information that you're saying was declassified and released from your security oath as of 2001. So 23 years have passed, but yet there's been no documentation from you to support any of that with tangible evidence of briefings or information or data or PowerPoint slides or anything. Is that an accurate statement?
No, you're absolutely wrong. I didn't declassify. It would have been nobody has to declassify it. They just said you're not under that restriction anymore. That when your NDA expires doesn't mean that the information that you had access to is declassified. You got that all wrong. That doesn't happen that way.
I'm
And
pretty, Mr. Doty. I'm
no,
sorry to interrupt, but I I am a security clearance holder and part of annual reviews with NISPOM and everything. And an NDA lasts as long as the classification of that information lasts.
well, it didn't happen. That it wasn't the policy and the procedure under the DoD Department of Defense Industrial Security Regulation 5200 when I was in, and when I signed off, when that my NDA or my security oath. If you're on fire, in fact, a security person within the government, you know what? There's no NDAs. It's called something else.
Yeah, it comes
And
on as
that
SF-86 and it's part of your security classification. You're reading into the program and it takes the OCA to declassify the original material. But if you did sign a security oath, or AKA an NDA, the NDA will only have an expiration date post the mandatory declassification of that information, or it will be rescinded up on the OCA declassifying that information. So if I'm reading your tweet correctly, by you saying that you're no longer under any NDAs or, as you say, security oaths, that would mean, that would allude to the fact that that information is now declassified, because if you have the ability to speak about it and everybody has the ability to hear what you say and you're not violating any classification concerns, by default that information is now non-classified.
okay, I don't agree with anything you say. So let's move on to the next question. I'm not going to argue that point.